6 mind games avoidance play when they're obsessed with you and how to outsmart them, but what nobody tells you is that obsession in this context rarely looks like what you expect. It doesn't arrive with constant attention, reassuring messages, or emotional transparency. Instead, it shows up in silence that feels intentional, distance that feels calculated, and moments of closeness that come just when you're about to give up. And the strange part is, the more confused you feel, the more attached you become because your brain starts treating unpredictability like meaning. You begin to analyze everything: when they text, when they don't, how long they take, how they respond, until you're no longer experiencing the connection, you're decoding it. And before you even realize it, you're inside a pattern that feels personal but is actually psychological. If you've ever felt stuck trying to figure out someone who feels half in, half out, just stay with this, and if this topic hits a little too close, you might want to subscribe, because once you see these patterns clearly, you stop falling for them in the same way again. The first mind game is something that looks simple on the surface but hits deeply when you're inside it: hot and cold switching. One moment there's attention, energy, even emotional closeness that feels real enough to make you believe you're finally getting somewhere stable. And then suddenly, without a clear reason, there's distance. Replies slow down, energy changes, presence fades, and you're left trying to figure out what you did differently. But the key thing to understand is that this shift is not random chaos. It creates rhythm, a rhythm your mind starts adapting to. And once your nervous system gets used to emotional inconsistency, it begins to anticipate closeness after distance, and distance after closeness. That anticipation is where attachment deepens, because now you're not just responding to how they treat you, you're waiting for the next emotional shift. It's no longer about connection, it becomes about prediction, and prediction keeps you emotionally locked in far longer than consistency ever would. And this is exactly why this behavior feels so addictive, even when it's clearly stressful. The second layer underneath all of this is the psychological effect of uncertainty, and it's far stronger than most people realize. Your brain is not actually designed to bond strongly with consistent reward alone, it bonds even more intensely with unpredictable reward. So when someone gives you attention in irregular intervals, your mind starts overvaluing every small moment of connection. A simple message feels bigger than it is. A short conversation feels meaningful. A return after silence feels emotionally amplified. Not because the connection is growing, but because your brain is trying to solve inconsistency by assigning meaning to it. And slowly, without noticing, you begin to confuse emotional spikes with emotional depth. The relationship doesn't feel stable, but it feels intense, and intensity starts replacing security in your perception of what connection should feel like. The second mind game is delayed responses on purpose, and this one is especially powerful because it operates in silence. It's not what they say, it's when they don't say anything. You send a message, and instead of a natural flow of communication, there's a gap that stretches just long enough for your mind to start building stories. At first, you tell yourself they're busy, then you start wondering if something is wrong, then you begin to adjust your own behavior around the silence. And without any direct interaction, control over the emotional rhythm of the connection quietly shifts. Because now your attention is no longer on your own life, it's on the waiting. And waiting, when emotionally charged, becomes a form of attachment in itself. The longer the uncertainty lasts, the more significant the eventual response feels, even if the content of that response is ordinary. What you're actually reacting to is relief, not connection. And this is where the psychological effect of waiting without answers becomes one of the most overlooked traps in these dynamics. When clarity is absent, your mind doesn't stay still, it works overtime. It fills gaps, creates explanations, revisits past interactions, and tries to predict outcomes. This mental effort creates emotional investment even when nothing new is happening externally. So the connection becomes something you are actively maintaining in your mind, not something that is being built between two people. And the more you think about it, the more emotionally involved you become, until your internal world is more engaged in the relationship than the actual interaction itself. That's how silence starts feeling like communication, and absence starts feeling like a signal, even when it's just absence. And by the time you reach the third mind game, emotional breadcrumbing, you're already emotionally invested in patterns rather than consistency. Breadcrumbing is subtle because it never fully disappears. There's just enough attention, just enough warmth, just enough presence to keep you emotionally engaged without ever creating stability. A message here, a reaction there, a brief moment of closeness followed by distance again. And because the brain is always looking for continuity, it interprets these fragments as potential, not reality, but potential. And potential is powerful because it keeps you emotionally attached to what something could become instead of what it actually is. You stop evaluating the relationship based on its current state and start evaluating it based on its highest moments, even if those moments are rare and unpredictable. And that is where the cycle quietly tightens around you, because hope becomes the glue that holds inconsistency together. And once hope becomes the glue, the dynamic starts to feel less like something you're participating in and more like something you're emotionally stuck inside, because the fourth mind game begins to operate in the background without even needing constant interaction. Acting detached while observing you closely creates a very specific kind of confusion where someone seems emotionally unavailable on the surface, yet somehow still responsive to your shifts in energy, your silence, your reactions, even your withdrawal. It can feel contradictory at first, like they're not really there, but also not really gone either. And this is what makes it so mentally consuming, because you start to believe you're dealing with someone who is emotionally distant, yet highly aware of everything you do. So you adjust yourself in subtle ways without even noticing it, less expressive here, more careful there, second-guessing what you say, monitoring how much you give, and slowly your natural emotional flow gets replaced with self-editing, where you're no longer just expressing yourself, you're managing how you might be perceived in response to their unpredictability. And beneath that surface tension is something even more subtle, the silent power shift they unconsciously try to maintain. Not through direct control or obvious manipulation, but through emotional distance that keeps the dynamic unbalanced just enough that you're always slightly more invested in resolving it than they are. Because the moment one person is more emotionally activated than the other, the system tilts. And in these dynamics, that tilt often goes unnoticed because it doesn't feel like control, it feels like uncertainty. But uncertainty itself becomes the control mechanism. You're the one seeking clarity, initiating repair, filling silence with meaning, while they remain in a position of emotional ambiguity that requires less effort to maintain. And over time, without realizing it, your internal world starts revolving around restoring balance that was never clearly defined in the first place. That's why it feels so exhausting. It's not just the connection itself, it's the constant attempt to stabilize something that keeps shifting shape. And then comes the fifth mind game, the one that often resets the entire emotional cycle even after you think you've detached, reappearing at random intervals. Just when distance has started to feel like the new normal, when your mind is finally beginning to adjust, there's a message, a reaction, a casual return that feels almost ordinary on the surface but carries a deeper emotional impact underneath. Because it doesn't come with explanation or closure, it comes as if the distance never fully happened. And that alone is enough to disrupt your emotional reset. Suddenly, everything you thought you were moving away from becomes active again in your mind. Not because anything has been resolved, but because reappearance reopens emotional memory. And the brain, especially in attachment-based patterns, tends to respond more strongly to reactivation than to consistency. It doesn't matter how long the silence was, the return compresses time emotionally, making the gap feel smaller than it actually was. And this is why their returns often feel more intense than their presence ever did. During absence, your mind fills the gaps with interpretation, reflection, and emotional buildup. So when they come back, they're not just returning to the present moment, they're returning to a version of them that your mind has been constructing in their absence. That's why the emotional spike feels disproportionate. It's not just the interaction, it's the contrast between silence and re-entry. And because of that contrast, even a simple message can feel loaded with meaning. But what's actually happening is a form of emotional conditioning where inconsistency creates higher sensitivity to reconnection, making every return feel more significant than the actual substance of what's being said. And under all of these patterns lies a sixth mind game that is often the hardest to recognize in real time because it doesn't feel like a game at all. It feels like testing emotional boundaries without explicitly stating it. Small delays, vague responses, slight shifts in attention, moments of warmth followed by withdrawal again. Not enough to clearly define distance, but enough to observe how you respond. And the reason this works is because it turns your reactions into information. Every time you adjust, over-explain, or try harder, it communicates something about your emotional flexibility in the dynamic. And without either person fully acknowledging it, the relationship becomes a silent experiment in emotional tolerance. Not intentionally cruel, not always conscious, but still impactful in shaping how the connection evolves over time. And the hidden motivation behind all of this is rarely about simple disinterest. It's more complex than that. In many cases, it's about emotional safety and control within intimacy. Closeness creates intensity, and intensity can feel overwhelming when someone's internal system is wired to manage connection through distance rather than immersion. So instead of engaging fully, the system regulates by pulling back, observing, re-entering, and distancing again, not because connection is unwanted, but because too much emotional closeness at once can feel destabilizing. And when you don't understand that internal process, their behavior can look like mixed signals, when in reality it is a form of self-regulation that unfortunately impacts the other person in the process. And once you understand that self-regulation layer, something important starts to become visible that changes how you interpret the entire dynamic. You stop assuming that confusion is random, and you start recognizing how often your own responses unintentionally escalate it. Because the core mistake almost everyone makes inside these cycles is believing that more explanation, more effort, or more emotional clarity will naturally resolve emotional distance. But in reality, emotional patterns don't respond to pressure the way logical problems do. They respond to pace, space, and perceived safety. So when one person is pulling back to regulate overwhelm, and the other is moving forward to create closeness, both are acting from instinct, but those instincts collide instead of align. And the more you try to fix the distance through communication alone, the more the system often intensifies, not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're speaking a language the emotional system isn't ready to receive in that moment. And this is where the real shift begins in understanding emotional non-reactivity as something far deeper than just doing nothing. It's not silence as avoidance, and it's not emotional suppression. It's the ability to stay internally steady when external behavior feels unstable. Because in these dynamics, the strongest pull isn't actually the other person, it's your own urgency to resolve discomfort immediately. And that urgency feels like intuition, like necessity, like truth in the moment, but it is actually activation. So emotional non-reactivity is not about disconnecting from your feelings. It's about recognizing when your feelings are amplified by uncertainty rather than clarity. It's the difference between responding from awareness versus reacting from nervous system pressure. And once you begin to notice that difference in real time, even if you don't always get it perfect, you start interrupting the automatic loop that used to control your behavior. And something very interesting happens when you slow your responses down, not strategically, not to create an effect, but naturally as a result of not being emotionally hijacked anymore. The dynamic itself starts to lose its speed. What once felt urgent begins to feel less immediate. Messages don't trigger the same spike. Silence doesn't create the same spiral, and instead of rushing to interpret every shift in tone or timing, you begin to hold space for not knowing without immediately turning it into a problem to solve. That space changes everything because it removes the emotional pressure that was previously driving the interaction forward. And when that pressure decreases, the entire connection either stabilizes naturally or reveals its inability to stabilize without constant emotional correction from one side. And this is where many people experience a quiet but undeniable shift in how they relate to their own emotional energy. Because when you stop feeding the cycle of immediate reaction, you start noticing how much of your mental space was previously occupied by anticipation, interpretation, and emotional forecasting. And as that begins to fade, something unexpected returns. You start having more presence in your own life again, not in a forced focus on yourself kind of way, but in a natural recentering where your attention is no longer constantly pulled outward. You start noticing things you were missing before, not because life changed dramatically, but because your internal noise finally softened enough for reality to come back into focus. And when you reach that point, what happens next becomes the true test of emotional clarity, what you choose to engage with going forward. Because now you're no longer operating from confusion, you're operating from observation. And from that space, you begin to see that not every connection that triggers intensity is meant to be pursued endlessly. Some patterns are not asking to be fixed. They are simply showing you how your emotional system reacts under inconsistency. And when you remove the urgency, you begin to see the structure underneath the emotion. You start recognizing whether there is genuine mutual stability being built, or whether the connection only feels alive when it is being emotionally activated through distance and return cycles. And perhaps the most grounding realization in all of this is that your worth was never defined by how someone responds during their moments of distance. Because in these dynamics, it's incredibly easy to internalize silence as rejection, inconsistency as personal inadequacy, and withdrawal as evidence that something about you needs to be changed. But once you step outside the reaction loop, you start seeing those interpretations for what they are: emotional stories created under stress, not objective truths. And that separation between story and reality is what begins to restore emotional balance. You no longer treat every shift in behavior as a reflection of your value. Instead, you begin to understand behavior as behavior, not identity, not judgment, and not a measure of your emotional worth. And from here, the foundation of everything changes. Because once you are no longer reacting from urgency, no longer over-investing in inconsistency, and no longer interpreting every silence as a personal signal, you begin to reclaim something that was always available but often overshadowed: your ability to choose how deeply you engage and under what conditions you stay engaged at all. And that is where emotional clarity stops being an idea and becomes something you actually live inside of, even when things are uncertain around you. And once you begin living inside that emotional clarity, instead of just understanding it intellectually, something subtle but permanent starts to shift in how you move through relationships. You stop entering situations with the same urgency to be chosen, to be understood immediately, or to resolve emotional uncertainty at all costs. Instead, there is a quieter internal stance forming, one where you are still open, still engaged, still capable of deep connection, but no longer willing to abandon your own stability just to maintain someone else's unpredictability. And this is where emotional maturity stops being a concept and becomes behavior, because now your decisions are no longer dictated by the emotional spikes of the moment, but by the pattern you can clearly see unfolding over time. You are no longer inside the reaction, you are observing the structure of it. And from this vantage point, something very important becomes visible that you could not fully see while you were emotionally entangled. Not every return, reconnection, or moment of warmth is a sign of progress. Sometimes it is just the continuation of a cycle that temporarily resets itself without actually changing. And this is where discernment becomes the most powerful tool you have, because now you are not just reacting to presence or absence, you are evaluating consistency over time. You begin to notice whether behavior actually evolves or simply repeats with different timing, whether communication becomes more stable or just temporarily improves before falling back into old patterns. Whether emotional availability is becoming a steady trait or just an intermittent phase triggered by distance. And once you start seeing patterns instead of moments, your entire interpretation of the connection changes. And in that clarity, another realization begins to form quietly but powerfully. You no longer feel the need to romanticize inconsistency just because it occasionally feels intense, because you've seen what that intensity costs. You've felt what it does to your nervous system when connection is unpredictable, when presence is inconsistent, and when emotional safety is conditional on timing you cannot control. And once you've experienced that enough times, your definition of what is good enough in a connection begins to shift. You stop being impressed by emotional spikes and start valuing emotional steadiness. You stop chasing chemistry that only exists in contrast, and you start paying attention to whether something feels safe even in silence, not just exciting in reconnection. And this is where emotional control reveals its deeper meaning: not control over the other person, but control over your own internal response to uncertainty. Because even when you understand everything, even when you've broken down the patterns and seen the cycles clearly, there will still be moments where your system gets activated. Moments where silence feels heavy again, where old emotional pathways try to reassert themselves, where the urge to reach out returns with familiarity.